Good morning to those joining us from any of the European time zones. This is the 9th session in our bi-monthly SG Declares and Shares series. In the way of a brief introduction, Construction Declares, now known as Built Environment Declares, is an online petition uniting all strands of construction and the built environment. It started in May 2019 and now has over 9,200 signatories, significantly companies in various disciplines and in 27 countries across the globe. The number of professionals engaged in the signatory companies now stands at over 1 million employees. In early January 2020, Singapore joined the movement with both SG Architects and SG Structural Engineers declaring. In June 2020, we set up the SG and the Global Environmental Consultants Declare platform. This means that any environmental consultants across the globe who wish to join will be helped by us and as administrators for the Environmental Consultants Declare. About the same time, the Singapore Landscape Architects joined the declaration. We now have a total of 55 Singapore-based signatory companies with over 50,000 professionals within these companies. For this session, we have two prolific speakers, Bernard Harrison, a dear friend of mine, and Tony Chan, a colleague, and we have Serina Hijjas as our moderator. For those of you who may not know Serina Hijjas, she is one of the creative directors at Hijjas Architects and Planners and is known for changing the building landscape of architecture through buildings that are responsive, energy conscious, and bold. Serina is the chairman of Green Building Index Accreditation Panel and vice president of Malaysia Green Building Council. The hope and the wish of the council is to bring awareness to flatten the current carbon trajectory. With that introduction and without further ado, I pass the session to our moderator, Serina, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Great to see everybody here. Thank you very much, Dr. Reza. I'm so excited to listen to Bernard Harrison and Tony Chan. And for those of you who don't know Bernard Harrison, let me just give a little bit of an introduction. Bernard has a double degree, honors degree in zoology and psychology and a master's in zoo design. When I met Bernard Harrison, it was actually for a project on a bird park in Putrajaya. And he actually, if you know very well about Singapore, has done quite a lot of work and extensive work. He joined the Singapore Zoo in 1973, established and managed the world's first night safari, which has become world famous because there is no other night safari in the world, but it first started in Singapore in 1994, and he left as the CEO of Wildlife Reserve Singapore in 2002 to set up Bernard Harrison and Friends, a dedicated zoo design company. He and his team designed zoos around the world, especially in Asia and the Middle East. Amongst his awards, Bernard was inducted into the International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions Hall of Fame in 2018 for his work in international zoo industry and received the American Creativity Association's Champion of Creativity Awards 2008 for his work on the Night Safari Singapore. Today, Bernard will be giving us a talk called Paradigm Shifts Often Happen from Outside Our Industry. Paradigm shifts occurs in every industry and are often initiated by outsiders. With an entrepreneur spirit, which you will see with Bernard as well, we see a strategic advantage and run with it sort of attitude. They fill a vacuum, often not seen by people in that industry, either because they are too close to the issue or so intimately involved that they miss the big picture, being caught or being too caught up with the details. Bernard, over to you.
Thank you. So I share screen back, do I?
Yes. We see your full screen. Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, well, Thomas Kuhn said scientific fields undergo periodic paradigm shifts rather than solely progressing in a linear and continuous way, and that these paradigm shifts open up new approaches to understanding what scientists would never have considered valid before. Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, which was a paradigm shift for what was considered the origin of species at that time. So the term paradigm shift, the term paradigm has been absorbed into the English language and can be used to describe less startling changes to the norm or existing paradigm. So what is a paradigm? It's a shared set of assumptions, a rule, a box, an established way of doing something, a social norm, and ideas that don't fit in are unwelcome. A paradigm shift is the same product, but different image, a shift in thinking, moving things we take for granted, basically thinking out of the box. I'll outline 9 paradigm shifts that have impacted the zoo and botanical gardens world over the past 100 or so years. And you'll see that of the 9 paradigm shifts, 7 have come from people outside the industry. The first paradigm shift was created by Karl Hagenbeck, a circus owner and animal dealer, when he set up his zoo in Hamburg in 1907. Instead of using visible bars and barriers and fences, he used hidden moats and created spectacular panoramas out of artificial rock. Although Hagenbeck's mountains were probably not made of reinforced concrete, the concept of reinforcement was there. As you can see from these images, the artificial rock panoramas were shaped with strategically placed a matrix of timber beams and then covered with mesh and concrete and hand carved. Nowadays, it's still done like that, or we use glass fiber reinforced concrete based on latex molds. The second paradigm shift was set up by George Millay, who was a businessman who specialized in setting up themed restaurants. Initially, SeaWorld was to be a themed underwater restaurant, but investors deemed it unfeasible, and he and his partners decided to set up a marine park to compete with Marineland of the Pacific. SeaWorld opened in San Diego in 1994. Paradigm shift, well, basically there were, of course, aquariums, but what Millay did was he took the fish and marine mammals outside with shows. His influencing factors were the sun and sea. Basically, Southern California is the playground for the Americans in winter, and he had interstate highways and budget travel. The third paradigm shift was Jimmy Chipperfield. Basically, the Chipperfields have a history of circuses, 300 years. Jimmy saw a potential use of the vast tracts of land that the aristocracy in the UK have in their estates. So they're titled, but they have no money to pay off their debts. So he made a deal with the Marquis of Bath and developed the first the first lion safari park in Longleat on the Marquis of Bath's land, and subsequently duplicated that formula in Johannesburg, Windsor Safari, Woburn Abbey with the Duke of Bedford, and several others in the UK. Essentially, Jimmy Chipperfield's paradigm shift was reversing the conventional situation, and he put the people in the cage, which is the car, and he let the animals roam free in a large fenced area. Because he had a circus background, he had plenty of lions, and he's used to setting up circus tents, so he just set up chain link fences, very low capital investment, and basically safari parks sprung up around the world following that formula. During the 1920s and 1930s, the London Zoo was a leader in zoo design, and they focused on the Bauhaus school, which originated in Germany. The Bauhaus school is a very, very brutal form of design. The fourth paradigm shift is the school of naturalism, a gradual movement which was started by a British architect named David Hancox, who had worked as an architect in London Zoo and was exposed to this heavy doses of Bauhaus design and this focus on concrete architecture. David was convinced that animals could and should be displayed in enclosures which simulate their natural surroundings as closely as possible. So Hancox moved over to be the director of the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle, and he set up the long-range plan for the zoo, and he hired a landscape architectural firm instead of an architectural firm called Jones & Jones, and its key designer was John Coe. And so basically they moved animals like gorillas out into vegetated enclosures. And at the time, it was thought to be very bad move by the zoo directors of the time. And they allowed gorillas to climb in trees and things like that. And they also used antibiotics, which were obviously in, but starting to be used effectively on a treatment of many animals. The fifth paradigm shift was underwater acrylic tunnels. This was created by a gentleman called Kelly Talton, who was actually a salvage diver and an underwater explorer from New Zealand. It was his dream to build an aquarium, and after some failed attempts, he finally found a site, which was actually a disused sewage treatment plant in downtown Auckland. And with a budget of $2.2 million and 10 months of construction, he created an underwater tunnel in that tank, filled it with seawater, filled it with fish and sharks, and created the first underwater world. Basically, the acrylic slabs have been used in aquariums for many years, but acrylic was basically developed in the 1930s. It was used during the Second World War in aircraft windows and submarine periscopes, and that was basically the most influential part of that paradigm shift. The next paradigm shift, the sixth paradigm shift, was the night safari, which was conceived by Lindy Elwes. Basically, 90% of all tropical mammals are nocturnal, and that's the reason why when you go to a zoo, you see the lions and tigers are asleep. And it was Lynn who came up with the idea, the simple paradigm shift, that why not have a zoo for nocturnal animals, which is open at night and allow the people in at night. Singapore is very lucky because it has regular sunset times, and it's very pleasant in the evening. If you did that in temperate climates, it would be cold and unpleasant in the evening, and you have vast differences of up to 3 to 4 hours in sunset times between winter and summer. The seventh paradigm shift is Disney's Animal Kingdom, and that was set up by Disney Corporation. It's probably the most expensive zoo ever built. It cost $1 billion, and it had a return on investment in 4 years. Basically, Disney bundled Animal Kingdom with Magic Kingdom, Disneyland, Disney's MGM Studios, and Epcot to form bundles of themed attractions and themed resorts for the family, and that has that has been taken up now in China in resorts like Chimelong and Dragon Dream Animal World in Hangzhou. The next paradigm shift is Sea Life Aquariums. Basically, Merlin Entertainment owns and operates a chain of 60 sea life parks around the world, and they are the second largest company after Disney. And they have set up these, have acquired all these different aquariums around the world. Basically, Nick Varney, the CEO of Merlin, was running an attractions division of Varden, which is a health and fitness company. And he instigated a management buyout in 1998, and he landed up with 22 sea life parks. He then joined forces with a company called Blackstone, which is a big international investment venture capitalist company, and acquired a range of theme parks and themed attractions like Madame Tussauds and Legoland, and then ended up with finally his 60 sea life attractions. In 2019, a consortium including Blackstone and Lego agreed to acquire Merlin Entertainment for $7.5 billion US. And finally, the last attraction is the Eden Project, and that's a botanical gardens with two large biodomes, one tropical and the other Mediterranean. The tropical biodome is 1.5 hectares in size. The overriding theme is plants which are associated with man, and the underlining theme is environmental education. Basically, this is Tim Schmidt, who conceived the project. He's actually a trained archaeologist and musician, and he got a government Millennium Grant for about 250 million Singapore dollars. It's one of the first biodomes with artificially controlled environments made from ETFE thermal plastic, mostly hexagonal panels made from 3 layers of ETFE, thus providing insulation and also allowing UV light in for growing the plants. Eden's development has and the use of ETFE has led in new directions in zoo design, and this is the latest zoo attraction in the Leipzig Zoo. It's a 2-hectare biodome using ETFE. It's called Gondwana Land, and it is a very interesting themed park. So basically, of the 9 paradigm shifts, only 2, the School of Naturalism and Night Safari, were established by people working in zoos. Whereas the other 7 were developed by people or corporations who are involved only in the fringe of the industry. Entrepreneurs fill a vacuum, often not seen by people in that industry. They see the big picture, they're not bogged down by detail, and often there is a commercial or strategic advantage. I wonder what paradigm shifts have occurred in your industry. Thank you very much.
We were discussing this much earlier about paradigm shifts, and I think that the impact of paradigm shifts have been seen in every field. But I don't think we've been very conscious about how we actually see the shift and the moves. If there's any questions, please type into the chat group. We will take the questions after the second session, and I'd like to do an introduction with Tony Chan, our next speaker. So Tony comes from Arab's planning business leader for Southeast Asia. With background in urban planning and sustainability, he has led various large-scale projects in Australia, China, and around the Southeast Asia region, including the Eastern Economic Corridor strategy in Thailand, Indonesia's new capital city, which we've seen quite a bit in the news, ADB's Urban Climate Change Resilient Trust Fund, and various ecologically and transit-focused master plans in China. His expertise lies in delivering multidisciplinary projects in an integrated, low carbon and resilient manner. This includes developing master planning and urban design with associated strategies to maximize value, future-proofing projects, and addressing sustainability and natural resource consumption. Tony also sits in the ULI Asia's Pacific Resilient Cities Council. And I'd like to introduce his title for today, Imagining Cities in an Era of Climate Change, Potential Future Scenarios and Examples of How We Can Adapt from a Planning Perspective. Tony, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Serina. I think, the push for sustainability in a built environment has been our passion in, all the years we've known each other. I think both from the industry as well as within, the types of projects we're involved with. I think for us, in the planning environment, I think it's getting a bit more challenging in terms of how fast we need to respond to changes, especially in climate and post-COP, all the activities that's going to happen after that as well. I think I know I'm sort of informing the knowledge in this group, but every time I research more and more on, year-on-year basis when I'm doing presentations, I keep getting surprised and shocked at how fast things are moving. This image, if you look at glaciers and climate change, the Mendenhall Glacier and how much it's changed, since the 50s. And the image below is 2011. I actually went on a cruise to Alaska in May 2019, right? And see with my very own eyes, even between 2011 and 2019, how far the glacier has retreated. And being May, it's not even quite summer yet, but it's already lost a lot of, not to mention the glacier, but a lot of the snow cover that's usually around there at that time of the year. So I mentioned about the Mendenhall Glacier, right? And then being out in Alaska in 2019, I think the surprising change you see, before our very eyes. Bernard would know this a lot better than me. What we're also seeing is how animals and biodiversity has changed with polar bears crossbreeding with the grizzly bears, producing the Growler bears. I think the first one was discovered in 2006. And then, of course, it's more and more of them up north, Canada as well. Then when we look at the numbers, the hottest 6 years on record were the last 6 years. And the warmest 20 years ever is out of the last 22 years. So the numbers are staggering, happening right before our very eyes. When we started talking about climate change and trying to control CO2 emission, at that time, we were trying to cap it below 400. But what you're seeing is about 419 today. And I think if it reaches about 500, you're talking about a 3 degrees increase in global temperature. Post-COP and Climate Action Tracker, when they look at what every country is committed towards, I think the only country that's within the 1.5 degrees compatible target is only Gambia. Singapore, where I'm sitting, sits at the very other end, where it's critically insufficient. I think Singapore has its own challenges as well, right? Because of natural gas consisting of 96% of the energy supply, limited land in terms of how much you can push towards solar and other forms of renewables. but all the projections are showing we're heading towards, the 2-3 degrees sort of world. And as you know, with a 3-degree scenario, that affects everything globally in terms of how how corals might calcify, how much coral reefs we're going to lose in a different scenario world, in a lot warmer world. When it comes down to the built environment, right, where are we heading? Do we throw to sort of acclimatize and trying to adapt to a change world? We throw more greeneries on buildings to both control the temperature. We're seeing a lot of innovative ideas around adapting to this change world. This was just announced not long ago in Busan. I think it's BIG together with the United Nations, a floating city, which is targeted to be built in Korea. But traditionally, we've seen all this happen before, right? Lake Titicaca in Mexico, you see floating sort of water-based developments in Thailand. And I think this was showcased during the World Cup previously as well, in the same village in Thailand. In Singapore, how there's a lot of plans in terms of how it's going to adapt to this changed climate. They're projecting at least a sea level rise by 1 meter, temperature rise ranging between the 1.4 to 4.6 degrees Celsius. So there's a lot of initiatives being pushed out in terms of how we want to mitigate and protect the coastline. Especially, there's a couple of studies being done now on the south coast of Singapore. I think when being a planner and how we design things up front, I think it's, like I mentioned, is a lot more challenging now, because we not only have to be planners, we have to be engineers as well. We have to understand future trends. We have to understand how things are implemented for various systems: energy, water, waste, mobility, how fast mobility trends are changing. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the system is integrated and resilient. We have to build in redundancy. We have to make sure it responds well. And then there's the whole digital component in terms of how digital enables the different objectives we are all targeting, and how it communicates data shared, as well as the security aspects as well, right? You see, when Facebook crashes, everyone goes crazy. I think the digital aspect is an area where we're also looking very closely, and how that links with how secured your systems are. We use various frameworks. This is one we developed with the Rockefeller Foundation in terms of how we look at city resilience. So as part of the ADB Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund, a lot of it is spent educating government officials on the ground, utility providers, etc., in terms of why you should not be looking at things in a siloed manner, and how various aspects are interlinked as well. We are working with the Resilience Shift. So if you go on the Resilience Shift website, you can actually download a lot of freely available information around systems, around resilient infrastructure, how we want to plan for disruptions that's going to happen in the future. I think even in terms of energy, our energy team is looking at what would an energy system to be more resilient be like in 2035. We're working with the Singapore government in terms of how we also add in hydrogen into the mix to ensure that supply is more resilient and lower in carbon. In Thailand, there's various initiatives being done, but what we find challenging, especially in Southeast Asia, is a lot of the lead is led by the conglomerates. Government is not quite as well equipped to push, forward-looking trends, etc. So we are working with a client there from CP Group, and they have a foresight team called Future Tales Lab. So we are working with them to look at different scenarios and what this means for Bangkok in 2050. One of the scenarios was actually a decentralized resilience. You know, what happens in 2050 when Bangkok is 50% flooded? Would it result in sort of planned community, but isolated from the wider Bangkok? And how does infrastructure work to adapt to that sort of scenario? What would happen to communities? How people would move? How they would, access different things like education, work? What would mobility be like? But at the same time, does it mean that the richer that can afford it gets into this communes, and then it affects the social and the less richer part of society? How would they adapt as well? So I think with the different scenarios, then we work out in terms of what possible actions might be needed from policymakers, from developers, and then communities as well, how they would respond to a certain sort of scenario, in this case, climate change. I'll touch on a couple examples. I think when I got informed or got introduced to Arab when I was back in university, Dongtan was the first eco-city. When you Google sort of the world's first eco-city, the project Dongtan always comes up. But as you know, planning is a very traditional, very conventional, it responds very slow sort of industry. What's been happening, as you know, I think how we develop zoning plans, how we develop guidelines hasn't changed much at all from decades back. When we conceptualized the whole concept of Dongtan, we were trying to go for a zero carbon target. This is way back in the early 2000s. As part of the planning work, we did all sorts of modeling to make sure that we tried to incorporate all available renewables. We look at various systems, including not having fossil fuel vehicles within the site itself. Our energy team look at the different parts of the energy systems and how it can contribute towards a zero carbon environment. Even on the planning sides, we were looking at how we can match in resource consumption in terms of, and tie it back to land users. If we were to move land users around or move mobility a certain way, how much resources are consumed, how much carbon is being emitted, etc. But ultimately, Dongtan was never built. A lot of challenges when we try to push the implementation program. Various articles written online to say that it's greenwashing by Arab. I think, but within the company, it's I think we seriously wanted to do good. But the challenge in this case was that we didn't understand the local context well enough. There's some political play in terms of the government officials that were pushing for the program, and then they got sidelined. When we look at the energy scenario, I think the grid, the energy company in China itself, were not interested in terms of localized renewables. They can hit their national target by putting a wind farm out in Xinjiang, for example, and still hit the target they have to achieve in terms of renewables percentage. The planning system in terms of the zoning plan does not accommodate for any sustainable targets. Hence, for us, it was lessons learned, but nothing was built for Dongtan. But it's just being revived at the moment. They're looking at a much smaller scale development of maybe 3,000, but having more agricultural lifestyle. That led us to another project in Beijing, where we knew of the challenges of our experience in Dongtan before. So what we were trying to do here is, since zoning plans in China was kind of very fixed, the indicators around the zoning plans would be things like plot ratio, development density, open space, accessibility. But when we are trying to push sustainability targets within a development, how do we go about it when the planning system doesn't accommodate for it? And guidelines doesn't mean anything in China, right? So we worked with the developer and the Beijing Planning and Design Institute to say that once we model all the KPIs, let's try putting in energy targets and the water targets directly into the zoning plan in China. So essentially, we were trying to change the planning system. So we got that through for the first time in China. It took a longer time to push that through together with the Beijing Planning and Design Institute. So we managed to put energy targets and water targets directly into the zoning plan. And hence now in China, anyone else could follow such a system when they are rolling out plans. It got built, won various international and national awards. But the targets weren't exceptionally high because the main aim for us was to make sure that the private sector that was doing it doesn't get uncomfortable. But at the same time, we were trying to change the planning system in China. Hence, now we are trying to push it a bit further with C40 in terms of how do we design for a low carbon, zero carbon town and yet be economically and socially thriving. So I think you can access this for free online, just Google search for it. So in terms of the energy and the carbon side, we are trying to build in operational targets. We are trying to build in the embodied carbon. We're also looking at consumption-based emissions and have some of the principles built into this guideline as well. Data is always challenging when climate's changing. So we can't really plan based on past data, right? Information. It doesn't make sense for us to project what the last 50 years is going to be and then trying to set, for example, the flooding level in 1 in 50 years or 1 in 200 years, because the past data doesn't tell us much at all. So internally, we have our own system called weather shift, where we project it against different climatic scenarios using the IPCC models. And then we plan against that change scenario. For example, depending on the risk the project is willing to take and which scenario we choose. So for example, in some instances, it's showing that within the urban area, you're looking at 3 to 6 degrees temperature increase. Hence, how do we look at the cooling strategy? How do we have sheltered walkways for people when they're walking between key points and other mitigation measures as well? I think we are starting to also relook the building itself. As I mentioned, it's also challenging when trying to do mixed use in 3D, right? Because planning is always in the past done in 2D. So in terms of utilities, for example, we are working with Sydney Water, trying to help them understand how their water systems can be more resilient in a changed future. And then other areas in terms of mobility, etc. I think a couple of last slides. As projects, we're also testing a few things. This is built a few years back for BIQ House in Hamburg, Germany. It's a bioadaptive facade using algae, and then all the algae that's harvested is being pushed to a biogas plant at the basement of the project. It supplies about 1/3 of the heat demand for the 15 residential units. Not quite the efficiency of solar PVs, etc., but it's just something we wanted to try and see, how it eventuates. In Singapore at the moment, we are working with the Singapore government to look at when EVs and AVs come in the future, would that free up more space for the pedestrian pathways for non-motorized vehicles? Would that translate to more commercial spaces on the site, making more efficient use of the roadways itself? And also working in national parks, what does this increase in greening, if available, when spaces are freed up, and how does that contribute towards carbon absorption, etc.? We are looking at things like drone ports. This is with Uber Elevate, with Picard Chilton, the architects. We also help them design out what the airports, the drone ports might be like. We did something similar for Marina Bay in Singapore as well, especially in the challenge traffic environment. For example, Bangkok, Philippines, Manila, for example, some of the drone solutions might be needed in the future. So I think in conclusion, for us in the planning and built environment side, I think that integrated systems approach thinking has to be dealt with right up front. I think we have to move away from traditionally how planning is done, do a concept plan, build up the zoning plan, develop the infrastructure plan, and then start subdividing out the land and then build it. I think a lot of the thinking and integrated approach has to be done up front. I think we have to look at it from all the scales, from global, regional to local and buildings, how we strategize all along the way to hit a lower carbon target. Targets wise, we need to push a lot harder. You saw the numbers I showed earlier in terms of city and national commitments. Definitely not high enough. I think the mitigation approach is I don't think we're gonna hit any of the targets. So the adaptation side it's what we are working with a lot at the moment. And then I think the leadership we require, both governance, industries, built professionals, built environment professionals, and the innovators, like what Bernard has shared earlier, all contributes towards this push for a lower carbon future. Thanks a lot, Serina. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Tony. That was an incredible amount of information packed into 12 minutes. I'd like to take some questions from the floor before I actually ask some of my own questions. Bernard, are you still there with us?
Yeah, yep.
Thank you, Bernard. I'd like to start with some questions from the floor that we've received. One of them is with regards to the dolphins. I think there was a question on the dolphins at
So yeah, I answered.
Yeah.
I typed an answer to that. I think the dolphins are still there, and I don't think that, but I don't know. I haven't checked up on it recently.
I mean, there was a great preview on the evolution of spaces, which was mentioned by one of on the chat group too. I think the question is there any, what do you see as the possible impacts of climate change on and biodiversity on how we look at designing zoos? I think that was one question with regards to that. And it's the solutions to our environmental challenges coming from the energy sector or anything else that will impact the change you see now?
Well, I think one thing about climate change impact on zoos obviously is that the ETFE sort of biodomes will obviously be one way to go if we really have to control environments. You try not to, but I mean that's the problem, and so places like Leipzig and Zurich, which have developed them, have tried to use sort of a carbon, at least for them to be carbon neutral. But one thing that struck me when Tony was giving his talk about the coral reefs dying because of climate change, which is happening right now, is that there's also, before the corals came into being, there's a thing called the stromatolites, which are cyanobacteria, clumps of cyanobacteria, big clumps, which look like coral. And in fact, there's still one reef left in northwestern Australia in a place called Shark's Bay. And it would be interesting to know, in fact, if coral dies out, whether in fact stromatolites might take over again and be interesting. Stromatolites actually were around 3.5 billion years ago, but they're really ancient. Anyway, that's my 5 cents.
Right. No, I think the aspect of the coral dying is, of course, quite daunting. I think more than that is also the impact on sea life. I think if this other form of traumatolite actually assists, it still allows the sea life to continue, or will there be a bigger impact on sea life? Another question here is to Tony, is how would the ideas underpinning regenerative design help us in our endeavors to tackle the global heating challenge?
I think, Serina, you did this presentation at CEM a couple of weeks back. I think you covered quite a bit of that as well. I think for me is the big numbers we have to tackle, right? I think the days of taking small steps is way past based on the challenges we have. I think when even that question you had earlier about the energy industry, oil and gas, we are definitely not addressing them enough. Oil, gas, and coal, they clearly are the major issue, problems we are facing. Hardly any mention of that in COP. I think when they even set up the oil and gas climate initiative, and you see what's being rolled out in terms of sustainability, because they are being pushed by the shareholders, is nothing. I think you look at their numbers, it's like 2% put towards non-core initiative. So I think we really have to engage with the oil and gas industry a lot more. We start thinking about, how can they transition towards another product, whether it's large scale plastics or whatever, just to lock in carbon as opposed to into energy. But getting back to regenerative design, I think it really depends on how much of an impact we are doing. I think there's obviously a role that it plays to lower heat island effect, but that's really a adaptation on how we respond to that changed temperature as well, right? But Serina, maybe you can add to that your experience and research based on your previous presentation as well.
Well, I think on the heat island aspect, as I mentioned in the last talk, is that, Penang Island, we've already done the measurements. We're already at 1.5 degrees change has happened and measured up in Singapore, in Penang. And when we were doing the Penang South Island, it was very interesting to see some of your planning examples there, is that trying to bring all this information down to the ground and moving from the ground up quicker than top down. I think that's the challenge here. I've seen a lot of your slides just now, and a lot of this information I don't think has actually trickled down fast enough to this sort of working level. And if it does, then I think we'll be able to see a larger shift. Bernard, I mean, you've been looking at, different examples of zoos. And for me, it's looking at the 9 typologies of the evolution of these zoos. They've been based on the experience. I mean, I liked it when you actually showed us, I didn't really think about it as the underwater world. It's like walking in water, now walking underwater, now walking within water. And then the other experiences are seeing animals in their natural habitat, walking through the natural habitat. It's all been actually a growing evolution towards merging our experience close with nature, and interjecting some other aspects to that. Are you seeing another shift? Do you think that in terms of your ideas on zoos?
No, I don't think so. I think what hopefully what will happen is that the natural school of design will continue, the one that was set up by David Hancock's, in a sort of a push against this Bauhaus sort of a architectural stuff. And so going back to nature, it's a nice idea. I mean, obviously we do that in Singapore. We do it in quite a lot of zoos in the West, but it's not, I mean, there's 15,000 zoos in the world, zoos and aquariums, and I would shut down about 90% of them. So I think, you know, it'll take time to catch on. And so I would just keep pushing, just try and be naturally focused. But use nature as a benchmark.
That's, I mean, I'm sure for those who are from the WWF, they like the idea that you just said close 90% of them.
Yeah, we should. It's lots of horrible zoos in the world. And I mean, I think the dolphin question, which was provocative, it's important. I totally agree. I don't think dolphins should be in captivity. Resorts World, the aquarium was actually built for whale sharks, which they didn't bring in because it was too sensitive. And I think it's now World Association of Zoo and Aquarium has asked to ban elephant rides in all zoos in the world. Even things like polar bears are dodgy in captivity. Dolphins are certainly dodgy. Killer whales have been banned, basically. I mean, I think SeaWorld still has a couple, but I don't think they're allowed to get any new ones. So, I mean, slowly the impact is, I mean, the zoo world is getting more savvy. And so those which are in internationally recognized associations should be left open and the rest should be shut down. You know, they don't follow environmental conservation policies.
We have a question from Ong from the SG perspective. I observe that many natural escapees have migrated into Singapore. Otters, jungle fowl, mouse deer, crocs, wild pigs, they're all crossing from Malaysia into Singapore. What can we do about this? Will Singapore and the neighboring countries truly cooperate? Not sure what this question means. Maybe Bernard.
I'm not sure whether all of those are escapees. I mean, I don't think mouse deer swim, so I don't think that. I think there's indigenous populations of mouse deer. There's indigenous populations of otters. It's nice that the otters are there, and I don't know if you know the Singapore otters. I mean, really famous. I think 3 or 4 different troops or groups or rafts or whatever you call otters, and they're kind of like cool, and they go into CBD, go into buildings, catch people's expensive koi and eat them, and it's great. I mean, I just love it. they're just bandits.
I think somebody said that during the pandemic, when everybody was at home, the animals were starting to sort of have a much better free reign and not be in captivity where they were. So maybe that's what they meant by escapees.
Yeah, but I mean, I think like, I mean, obviously the macaques, long-tailed macaques, and wild boars are 2 sensitive, problematic animals which have to be contained, controlled. In Berlin, which also has a wild boar problem, Singapore doesn't have a serious wild boar problem yet. Berlin has a huge wild boar problem. I mean, they really do go around and control the streets. You know, at some point you just have to start culling, because that's what happens in the wild. In the wild, there would be leopards and tigers to control them, and you don't have leopards and tigers in Singapore. So it's just, you have to shoot them, you know, basically take them out at some point.
Tony, there's a question for you. Shifting our paradigms from a potential 3 to 4 degrees, and maybe this actually will touch also on zoos, but shifting our paradigm from a potential 3 to 4 degrees increase in atmospheric temperature to 1.5 degrees seems a highly disruptive one. Is there a precedent for such paradigm shift to the scale of climate change we are facing? I think this is an underlying question for most of us in the back of our mind.
Yeah, it's a definitely challenging one. One we hope that we don't reach, but I'm a bit of a pessimist after COP26.
Or realist.
I'm in pessimist in the sense that when you look at what governments committed to and what they actually deliver, we'll hit the target way off. And with government, it's always, their terms are not the well-intentioned ones. Do not have a term long enough to do good, but they have short enough terms to screw everything else up. So I think for us is pushing industries like the oil and gas guys a lot harder, but also think of new ways where they can transition a lot faster. Because a 3-degree world, it's one where we may have to put in the ETFEs all around us to adapt to that different environment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
but I think,
absolutely.
I think also we we'll have to look at it strategically as well. I mean, yeah, of course, we don't want it to happen, but when it happens, I mean, obviously, there's going to be huge tracts of land which are going to be opened up. I mean, Greenland, Alaska, Canada, which is all under permafrost, Siberia, Antarctica. I mean, they're going to be fertile places. And I mean, so strategically, there's a whole shift in power, which is going to happen as well in the next 40, 50 years. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of hypotheses going out there, Bernard, as well, right? Because with the increased temperature and humidity rises, there's also a hypothesis that cloud cover will be a lot more, and with the spin of the Earth, a lot will be pushed to the poles, and that itself might restrict fertile land to be fertile, right? You might not get enough sunlight at the pole, and especially up north, where majority of our population is, without enough sunlight. I mean, these are the crazy scenarios we are playing with that could possibly happen, right? And what does
these
that
the
mean?
kind of scenarios you're talking about in Arab?
Yeah, because we're also looking at planetary boundaries and all that, what that means to us. So I think those are the scary scenarios, but we have to start thinking of those far-fetched scenarios to let us come up with more innovative solutions as well.
I like the floating islands idea. I think, Bernard, we definitely can shift that into the zoology experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I just came back from Bangladesh, which is another country that's got a huge problem. Yeah, but so if you floating islands, it doesn't really matter. So I think the whole concept got to change a bit. And of course, Amsterdam lives 14 meters below sea level anyway, doesn't it? Just
Yes.
where they got money.
So I think we have a last question here, a few questions here. We've done the degrees. I'm not sure, how do parrotfish help with preservation of coral reefs? At the extent that we're talking about, the question that's been brought up is really going to impact. So,
given that we're running out of time and the fact that I asked that question, maybe that's to Bernard. I read an article about how parrotfish obviously sort of eats the algae and recycles it to sand, and the algae that would otherwise suffocate the coral reef. And then this important function that this beautiful fish plays, we instead of allowing it to do that, we just kill it and eat it. So I thought that maybe that would be a question to finish this session with. But there are many other questions as well that we can in writing we can get the answers from Tony and Bernard. Our time is up. I just thank all three of you, Bernard, Tony, and Serina, for this beautiful session and presentation. And the recording will be on the YouTube channel. And do please, those who want to have a look at it again, because there's a lot of information, as Serina said. And also do please share it with your friends and colleagues so that we can spread the good word. Thank you again until our next session, which is going to be in January 2022, about the bi-monthly session. And we will see you then. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much,
Take care.
Bernard
Bye.
and Tony. Bye.
Thanks,
Take care.
Rina. Bye.